Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and we have a great presentation for you today. Just a few things before we get started. First, please utilize the chat box if you have questions throughout today's presentation, and I'll try to answer them, all of your questions during our Q&A session. And the second one is the last thing. Please note that the webinar is being recorded. And a recording link will be provided in a follow-up email later today on our website. I'm Dr. Pete Obenauer. I've been with VDCI now for approximately 1 year. Prior to that, I was with the United States Navy for a little over 23 years, where I did operational as well as research tours overseas, mainly focusing on malaria and several other vector-borne diseases. So today, just a little bit, we'll discuss about VDCI in general, who we are. Our mission here is to target all phases of the mosquito life cycle to prevent the transmission of diseases and abundant mosquito populations. Not only are we concerned, obviously, for the disease aspect that mosquitoes bring, but we really believe that mosquitoes are they hit morale for people. Obviously, nobody likes to go out, and so in an area that has large number of mosquitoes, and so it also brings peace of mind to enjoy outside and not have to deal with that. We have been in business now for over 30 years, and we also have a lot of government partnerships, especially when it comes to natural disasters such as hurricanes, any tropical systems like that. We usually have a lot of people in our facility that work hand in hand with government agencies. So for today's agenda, I would first going to talk a little bit about the dangers of some of the mosquito-borne diseases, and why reviewing data is so important. We'll talk a little bit about the 2022 mosquito season and what kind of certain diseases that we saw, and perhaps why we didn't see other ones. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to protect the public health out there and incorporate certain integrated mosquito control programs that you all can use in your communities. And finally, we'll wrap up today's presentation with a Q&A session. So the dangers of mosquito-borne diseases. Well, for those of you many of you already know that mosquitoes have been around for millions of years, and during that time they have transmitted a wide variety of diseases, not only humans, but animals as well. So they pose a significant public health threat around the world. And right there in your slide, you can see that they account for more than 17% of all infectious diseases. So certainly that's a huge number when you take an account of all the diseases around the world, waterborne diseases. Mosquitoes still make almost a quarter of those diseases. We're obviously concerned about mosquito populations and the risk associated with them. And especially now, and the reason why we're concerned is a couple of things. We're seeing a rapid urban development taking place around the globe, really, for the last 30 to 40 years. And this has significant impact because as man or as humans continue to move into those areas that are inhabited by mosquitoes, you're going to get bitten, right? And the chances of you getting a vector-borne disease usually will go up as well. We've also seen weather events in the last 20, 25 years that have brought large-scale flooding to areas that perhaps might not have been prone to flooding. And again, this is due to the change of how the environment around us, what we build, and how those things, how they impact our areas, and they provide also great areas for sometimes mosquitoes. And finally, obviously, abnormal temperatures. Climate change has had an impact on this. We've seen where warmer temperatures today here in Tennessee, it's 82 degrees, very warm. This is very conducive timing for mosquito breeding And so we see movement of certain diseases into the higher latitudes. So why is it important to review this data? Every year we compile a list of the diseases that we have seen throughout the United States. And it's important to revisit this because it allows us to actually take a look at the data and actually predict the subsequent year or sometimes following years. Many of these diseases move in cycles that we'll talk a little bit about. And by doing this, you can obviously get get a jump start to notify your health agencies in advance that we might be looking at a bad season. It also helps you to manage that mosquito control program. For those of you, you might be seeing a large increase in mosquito-borne diseases in a certain area. This might allow you time to prepare for the next season, especially if you're seeing high precipitation over the winter and early spring. And that might obviously give a pretty good indication that mosquitoes will take off coming in the early summer. So let's look at the 2022 mosquito-borne diseases in a review. And we'll go through a couple of these, and then we'll talk we'll discuss a couple that might not be ones that you constantly are hearing about. I'm sorry. Sorry for that, folks. I had a technical issue on my computer. So anyways, as we're going back to our review, our first disease that we're going to talk about today will be West Nile virus. Those of you who are familiar with West Nile virus, you know, we saw West Nile come in back in the summer of 1999 in parts of New York, actually near the Bronx Zoo. And this disease, when it first came introduced, many people saw many birds coming, were actually falling literally out of the sky. These birds had no immunity to West Nile. This was a virus that was new to an area. And anytime you have a virus that comes in, you usually have a spike in mortality before the populations, in this case, such as birds, become somewhat immune to it. So you usually saw huge die-offs of birds, and you still see that. But that particular year in 1999 was really a surprising one. So for 2022, we saw approximately a little over 1,000 cases, human cases, and out of that 1,000 cases, we had about 79 deaths. And so that was obviously, many people might not think that that's a significant, but that's actually, if it's obviously your family or friend, that's very significant. In 2021, just to compare those cases, we saw almost 3,000 cases, 2,911 human cases, and we saw 227 deaths in 2021. So we obviously did a little bit better in 2022, but keep in mind also, many times people are infected with West Nile and don't realize it and not necessarily go to the doctor. And so you always have to take some of these numbers and kind of think about that you're not only capturing, you're probably capturing a smaller part of the population than what the reality really is. There's approximately 150 to 200 mosquito species of mosquitoes that transmit this disease. Certain species, I'll use an example on the West Coast, such as Culex tarsalis, are better vectors and are usually the #1 vector of transmitting this disease. Usually there's only approximately about five Culex species, and they're normally Culex species that we're talking about here, that are capable of transmitting or have a really good chance of transmitting that virus. There are mosquitoes that do transmit West Nile, but it's important to understand that a lot of times they'll do this in an experiment or in a lab setting, or even in the wild. Just because a mosquito can transmit West Nile doesn't necessarily make it a primary or one of those top 5 that I just mentioned, such as Culex tarsalis. So that's something to always keep in mind as well. So when you look state by state, you know, some of the big states that usually report high numbers of West Nile, especially out west, usually tends to be Colorado, California, and in this case, in the East Coast, you have New York. But those are some of the big areas that to always watch. The highest death toll, though, again, Colorado is up there, but here we start to see California and parts of the South, such as Louisiana and Texas, come into play, where in Texas you had seven deaths, Louisiana 6, but obviously look there in Colorado, you had a total of 18. So certainly this has been an issue for Colorado, and they certainly look at the weather patterns because they've known that West Nile does, weather patterns and seasonality contribute to how West Nile, if they're going to have a bad West Nile year, is what I should say. So our second disease today that we're going to talk about is dengue. We think of dengue as it's a virus, but it's been usually focused in the subtropical to tropical areas throughout the world. However, dengue was alive and well here in the United States. Many people forget about this, but during the 1800s, dengue was here, and in fact, in the 1930s, as early as 1934, you had a huge dengue outbreak that affected thousands of folks in Florida. It's just the fact that through the years we have suppressed this Aedes aegypti, which is the primary vector here down at the slide there. We used to suppress this vector, and over the course of the last 20 years, it's actually come back into the United States. There was suppression from two reasons. One, you had an eradication program, but the second is you actually had Aedes albopictus come in and suppress this vector for a while, or displace it, I should say. And through the years, we've actually seen what's happened now is Aedes aegypti has been able to kind of come back and actually almost coexist now somewhat with Aedes albopictus. So areas that did not see Aedes aegypti now are now seeing Aedes aegypti. And we see Aedes aegypti's range in California, Texas, throughout the South as well. So when we look at the 2022 cases, we had actually 1,188 human cases. Now, some of these cases, the majority of these cases, are what we call travelers acquired dengue. In other words, those are individuals that travel to another country. They're out there, such as, I'll use an example, in perhaps a country in South America. They go out for dinner or sitting out there at lunch, they're getting bitten by Aedes aegypti, and they come back to the United States with that virus, and then they start having symptoms while they're here in the States. So that's called travelers acquired dengue. In 2021, the US case count was 117 human cases. And so as the third bullet there mentions, most cases were travel acquired, but there are only 59 local cases. And all of those cases were actually in Florida. Florida has been a hotbed right now of dengue. We've seen numerous cases in the Florida Keys, as well as Miami and Dade County. Occasionally, you also will see dengue creep up into southern parts of Texas. We've seen that especially with a migrant population that continues to move forward. That also will bring in many people who have dengue and then get bitten by Aedes aegypti, and then you have transmission that is occurring locally. Our third virus today is what we call La Crosse virus disease, or I should say La Crosse encephalitis. La Crosse encephalitis is usually found throughout the Midwest, all the way down through Kentucky and parts of Tennessee. Tennessee tends to be an area that we call an epicenter for La Crosse. Unlike other encephalitis viruses, this one, if you're comparing it to West Nile, we're always concerned with the elderly with West Nile, because it usually affects the elderly in greater numbers than La Crosse. La Crosse tends to infect and affect kids, usually below the age of 13. And so that actually is certainly something that you want to keep an eye out. La Crosse is interesting. La Crosse is one of the few viruses that's actually a sexually transmitted disease among mosquitoes, believe it or not. So this virus is transmitted through the male and female mating, and this virus is also transmitted through what we call transovarial transmission. What that means is when the female lays those eggs, if she's positive for La Crosse, those eggs are also positive for Crosse. And so this is an interesting disease, especially for us entomologists to study. Crosse is the reservoir, what we call where that virus is amplified, is usually chipmunks. Chipmunks represent the primary reservoir for this disease. And so the vector in this case is called the eastern treehole mosquito. We don't have there's a picture down there, but it usually has a white scales on the side of the thorax. This is a diurnal feeder. That is that it feeds usually in the early morning and usually during the right before evening. So it's somewhat considered a daytime biter just because those are the two peaks. It will actually feed throughout the day. And so what we have seen in 2022, we saw about 21 human cases that are there on the map. And then in 2021, we saw 39 cases. So, you know, there are not a lot of cases of this disease, but we look at it because it does have a high, it can pose a significant public health threat to kids, especially kids. And many times kids usually acquire this disease when they've gone out to the woods. They're playing in the woods and they're being exposed to large numbers of the eastern treehole mosquito called Aedes tricereatus. And then the Aedes tricereatus will readily feed on humans. And then obviously if they have that virus is then transmitted to the kid. And that's something we don't want to see. More than half of your 2022 cases, by the way, were reported in Ohio. And so many times those clusters that you see can either migrate northward or southern. So sometimes, like I said, Tennessee tends to be a focal area, sometimes Kentucky or Ohio, but basically all along that Appalachian area in parts of Midwest is Crosse, an area for Crosse. Our next vector-borne disease, and I'm sure many of you have heard about this one, is called Eastern Equine Encephalitis, or triple E. Triple E is found throughout, all the way from Florida, all the way up through Maine, and even in parts of the Midwest. And there you see, we actually had a case out in Montana. But triple E is just by the name it implies, is Eastern. In other words, it tends to be focused on the East Coast. There is a Western equine encephalitis that also is transmitted by another mosquito. But on the East Coast, we're talking about a mosquito called Culicida melanura. This is a mosquito that is a fairly robust mosquito. If those of you who've collected it, compared to a Culex species, it tends to be a little bit larger. This species of mosquitoes usually feeds on birds. So, I would say probably 90% of the time it feeds on birds, strictly birds. Now, that does not mean, obviously, that this mosquito will not feed on humans. And in fact, what happens is most of the time, if someone, let's say, is taking a walk in the woods during the evening, where this, if the opportunity comes to pass, this mosquito will feed on a human, and that's what happens. But the virus itself is circulated through birds and as well as horses, believe it or not. And horses are really can be negatively affected by this disease, usually death. This virus attacks the encephalon part of the brain, and that's the term encephalon. So encephalitis, that's basically a inflammation of the encephalon portion of the brain. So when we talk about, you know, anything that we hear encephalitis, that's not a good thing, right? We don't want that, because that's part of usually the brain, and you get brain swelling, headaches, and obviously you have a high mortality with this one. This somewhere between 30 to as high as 50% mortality. And I've heard a couple of cases in the last 20 years. A couple of years ago, we had a mother who gave a presentation at the AMCA about her 23-year-old daughter. So, you know, these are diseases, when it affects somebody you love, you really take it seriously. In 2022 cases, we're still waiting on the data for that. So I do not have the data right now, but we hope to have that data for you at a later date. But if we look at 2021 cases, you had 5 human cases and 2 deaths. And of course, as I mentioned about the statistics there, if you just had 5 cases, but you have 2 deaths, that's a pretty significant mortality rate. And then you had 110 animal cases reported in 2020. Our next virus that we'll talk about, and we don't necessarily see it here in the United States, although back in 2014, we had chikungunya that was really making its way from parts of Africa into India, throughout the Seychelles Islands, throughout the Southeast, and it eventually made its way throughout the Caribbean. And we saw chikungunya virus in the Caribbean. Chikungunya, by the way, those of you who are looking at that name and wondering, that actually is a Swahili name, and it actually is translated to mean bent over. So this virus causes extensive muscle spasms, muscle pain, specifically in the back, and usually a person might be laying in bed in a C shape because the pain is so bad within his back. So this has a wide variety of symptoms, but 30% of the time you usually can count on severe pain in the joints, as well as sometimes a high fever, and obviously something that's going to put you down for the count for a couple of days. Somewhat similar to dengue, but chikungunya is definitely unique. They are similar in the fact that they also are transmitted, just like dengue. Chikungunya is transmitted by Aedes aegypti. So you'll hear that name over and over again, Aedes aegypti. Aedes aegypti is definitely one of the big vectors for these viruses. Another vector is also Aedes albopictus, is capable of transmitting this virus. And in fact, back in the early, like I said, I mentioned 2014, we saw Aedes albopictus was actually responsible for the majority of the transmission going on. When you look at 2022 counts here in the United States, we had 47 human cases, and all of those cases were acquired by somebody traveling probably throughout South America or other areas like that, where they eventually got bitten by Aedes aegypti or Aedes albopictus. In 2021, we had 21 human cases, and again, those are also travel-acquired cases. Most of the cases that we have seen usually come from Illinois, New York, and California, and that's probably not surprising because obviously those states also have a high population and a high travel. A high portion of that population tends to do a lot of traveling throughout the world. Zika virus, for those of you, you might remember back, it was back in 2017, Zika was in the news. And again, here's another virus that again is transmitted by our friend down there, or foe, I should say, Aedes aegypti. This is another virus that unfortunately has similarities to a lot of other types of mosquito-borne diseases. In other words, you can get pain and fever. Many people do not actually show any symptoms at all. And so you might catch this disease and never know it, that it's actually circulating. Unlike other viruses, though, mosquito-borne viruses, this one actually is transmitted by through sex. So you can catch this through human to human. You don't necessarily need the vector, which makes it a kind of a unique virus when we talk about the mosquito-borne viruses. In 2022, we saw 3 human cases. These are all found to be travel-acquired cases. And the year prior to that, we saw about 4 human cases. As I mentioned, if you go back to 2017, in this case 2016, we saw 36,000 local cases. And so Zika was a disease that was really concerning, especially for the development issue for those women that were pregnant. This was a disease that really wreaked havoc on newborns. Please be patient for me. I've had another issue with the computer. Let's hopefully, there we go. So again, Zika was something that was really brought the public's attention to mosquito-borne diseases. Unfortunately, because of the media really focused in on that, which they should have, regarding the development issue for development fetuses. You had the obviously many babies were born with a small head and a lot of cognitive issues with that. So that's very unfortunate. Fortunately, though, we have not seen the Zika transmitted here in the United States in any sustainable time, which has been good. We're obviously monitoring that, though. Some other mosquito-borne diseases that I wanted to talk about in 2022 is malaria, St. Louis encephalitis, and Jamestown Canyon virus. So in malaria, again, we're still waiting on the actual data for that, but I will mention about malaria is malaria is a protozoan disease. This is another disease that we tend to focus in on the tropical areas. At one point back in the 1930s here in the United States, you had thousands and thousands of cases. And in fact, the last reported true malaria transmitted case during that time, it was native from the United States, was back in the 1950s. They believe that obviously screen windows played a huge part in bringing down malaria rates here in the United States, as well as just the overall development. As folks develop better homes, better sleeping areas, you prevent this mosquito, which is an Anopheles, in this case in the United States on the East Coast is known as Anopheles quadrimaculatus, from feeding. This does not mean, though, that malaria cannot happen. And I use a case back in 1997 in California where you had a large migrant population that was camped out near parts of Southern California. And these folks had malaria circulating in them. They were bitten by the local mosquito that transmitted malaria. And in fact, you actually had locally transmitted malaria. And so this can happen. We don't see it all the time, but it is something to be aware of. Just because we talk about it throughout the world does not mean that you can't have portions of the population that might be susceptible to malaria here in the United States. Worldwide, it still kills around 600,000 people. Most of those people that die from malaria are under the age of 5. So this is still obviously the Bill Gates Foundation, President's Malaria Initiative, Rollback Malaria program under the World Health Organization has really curbed the numbers that have people who have died from malaria. At one point, it used to be 1.1, 1.2 million deaths every year, and that has come down to about 600,000, in part due to bed nets, the widespread use of bed nets, as well as insecticide resistant spraying within local areas. The second one, St. Louis encephalitis, again, just like Eastern equine encephalitis and Crosse encephalitis, this is the one that usually we see outbreaks that occur a lot of times in the Missouri area, in the Midwest, but you also can have this found in Florida. In fact, St. Louis encephalitis usually follows patterns. We have many scientists that would develop modeling where they can actually predict when this disease will come out in huge outbreaks. We saw this back in the 1930s, 1940s, and a lot of times it's due to migration of birds, a typical migratory pattern, as well as weather patterns have a huge influence on how St. Louis encephalitis is transmitted, or I should say the numbers. In 2022, we saw 18 US cases. Finally, you might hear this new virus. It's not necessarily new, but we use the term re-emerging or emerging virus. And this is called the Jamestown Canyon virus. And we actually had 8 US cases of this virus as well. Not as significant as others, but it's something that just to be aware of, because you might be seeing the name of this virus in the future. So takeaways on the 2022 data that we've gotten is that, one is that although this season we saw huge numbers actually of West Nile cases. I forgot to mention that. We saw not cases, but in parts of Alabama and Mississippi, we had huge number of positive mosquitoes, not only just mosquitoes, but sentinel chickens. And so this was something that we saw this early on in the year where a lot of times you see West Nile usually comes in the latter part of the year, usually late July, August, September. We actually saw this coming up as early parts of, or latter part of May and early June, and that was at one point very concerning because we were fearing a really bad year. Fortunately, West Nile has not been we haven't seen huge spikes, but with the heavy wet winter that we were experiencing here in the south, we're certainly predicting a really bad mosquito season. So when we consider the data, you always want to look at the first of all, the step one, considering the 2022 data. And then based upon the data, based upon those numbers, not only the numbers, but you want to look at the kind of species composition that is making up your collections. So if you're seeing if you're down in Florida and you're seeing high numbers of Aedes aegypti, and you're living in Miami-Dade County, you certainly want to get that population under control, because that's certainly something that can be problematic, especially if you have people that are showing up with dengue and you have a high population. That can be problematic, obviously. The same thing goes for if you're having Culex tarsalis in your traps, high numbers early on, that might give you an idea that you're going to have a long mosquito season, and thus potentially a long West Nile season. The third step, based upon what you're evaluating your mosquito management efforts, you want to build around that. You want to build your IMM program, or in this case, your Integrated Mosquito Management Plan. And you can do this in a number of ways. You can be setting out traps more. You can also plan out how often you want to trap. You might have to step it up a couple more traps just to make sure that you're capturing times where, once you put those control measures in, and we're talking about truck mounted spraying or any kind of aerial spraying, if you're not seeing your counts dropping off to below that threshold, you might have to continue to increase the spraying, or also perhaps look at how much you're trapping to get a better idea of the mosquito population. Surveillance and disease testing. So we obviously, you're going out, you're setting up your traps, you're identifying, but you also want to test for these if possible. Obviously, sentinel chickens provide a good indicator for some of these diseases, but if you can, taking a subsample of your mosquitoes that you collect and testing them for these viruses helps. So you always, again, we mentioned types of mosquito species in an area, your population density, how many are there compared to other mosquitoes, and you always want to look at seasonality. Seasonality tends to be sometimes people forget that certain species will move into a different time of year. For instance, an example here in Tennessee, and usually August, September, and other parts of the South, you see huge numbers of of Serophora mosquitoes or floodwater mosquitoes. And this usually follows a heavy rain event, such as a thunderstorm or a tropical system. And then finally, once you have the composition of your mosquito, you can rule out, if you're coming up with tons of Serophora, you're probably not going to be worried about too many of those diseases, because it's not obviously a primary vector of those. So a lot of times the species that you're coming up with can let you know, do I have to be concerned? Do I need to be a little bit more vigilant on what I need to be spraying? So obviously huge numbers of Culex tarsalis, and I use that as an example out west, might mean that, hey, you really need to be on the lookout for West Nile. Obviously, with any mosquito control program, we always talk about larval and adult mosquito control. And larval mosquito control is really ideal. And why is it? Because you're really focusing on those breeding sites. And that's very important. Before, as I say, before you let those mosquitoes develop and get on the wing, where it makes it much harder to control because they're flying obviously all over the place. If you really can focus in on those larval habitats and get an early start on treating those areas, you're less likely to have a lot of adult countermeasures to knock down that population. Obviously, adult control methods. We here at VDCI, we do this through a use of fixed wing application, as well as drone application in the form of larvicides. Insect resistance. Those of you who have a mosquito control programs, I hope that at least some of you practice this. It really can help you identify populations. If you're seeing where you're out there spraying and you're not getting that kind of control that you saw maybe a month or a year ago, most likely you have insecticide resistance building in the population of mosquitoes. And so you do this by, those of you who haven't done this, what this shows is the CDC bottle assay. And so you basically coat these bottles with an insecticide, technical grade insecticide. Usually use acetone, and you mix that in with the insecticide and let that insecticide dry on the inside of those jars there. And then you usually put somewhere between 10 to 20 mosquitoes per jar and then you count how many minutes, and then you count how much knockdown you have. These, I know that the assays are, you can purchase those or request those, I should say, from the CDC, and usually they will help you out with even providing some training. If you haven't already had that training, you can get that training online as well. But obviously we want to have this or put this in part of our mosquito control program to really help us determine when you have a population that's resistant to insecticides. It'll save you money and it'll help you change over to an insecticide that's more effective and until you get that population that is susceptible to whatever insecticide you're using. Another part of our program that we offer is obviously public education. For those of you who operate mosquito control programs, you know that it's vital, it's critical to get the buy-in from the public. And we do this by talking at county fairs, perhaps Boy Scouts, any type of organization that involves a community. We usually try to get the buy-in from those folks, teaching them about mosquito control and teaching them about mosquitoes. Many times people don't realize that you can have mosquitoes in nothing more than a bottle cap, developing inside of a bottle cap. And so simple things such as keeping an area around your house picked up and not allowing containers to fill up with water is really critical and will save you a lot of time, and it'll also reduce the amount of insecticide that you're putting out in the environment. Because if you can take those steps to try to reduce those areas where mosquitoes are breeding, you'll save yourself a lot of headache in the end. And finally, we always focus in on those 4 Ds: defend, dress, drain, and dust till dawn. And so, we always want to wear a mosquito repellent, light clothing as possible. And as I mentioned, draining away or getting rid of standing water. And then finally, limiting your exposure especially in the early morning to late evening. So before the Q&A, I just want to let everyone know that there'll be a feedback survey at the end of the webinar where you can request a consult if you'd like to know more about our company, or would like for us to come out and take a look at your program and provide some guidance. We certainly do that. And the second thing is, I'd like to announce that we'll launch a poll as we begin the Q&A, and where you can let us know if you want to speak to somebody about an IMM program. And so right here you can see the quick poll. Would you like to you hit yes or no, and then we'll get back to you. So at this time, we're going to go through some of the questions that folks have sent in, or questions that you're submitting right now. The first question I have here is, can you explain the cycle of disease transmission, and can diseases be passed from person to person? So the most common viruses, in other words, this is not malaria. Malaria is a protozoan, but most viruses that we've talked about today, that virus is ingested when a mosquito bites an infected person. That virus is then pulled into the mosquito gut, where that virus can replicate. That virus is replicating, moves out of the mosquito gut, and that virus then now needs to go all the way back to the salivary glands. Salivary glands are in the mosquito by the head, and that's where those viruses will then concentrate. And then the next person that that mosquito will feed on, that virus will then be transmitted back into the human. Yellow fever and all these other viruses are not transmitted to human. The only virus that I can think of that would be passed from person to person without the action of a mosquito would be Zika, as we talked about. In that case, sexually transmitted. It's considered an STD because you're actually transmitting that Zika that's usually found in fluids of human, and other folks can acquire that as well. The second question, are there any risks to humans or the environment when using ULV spraying for mosquito control? We get this question a lot, and I always try to focus in on what you're doing. And so if we talk about ULV, what that means is obviously ultra low volume. So you're putting out such a fine amount, and you need that fine amount for a reason. That fine amount are in what we call micrometers, usually about 10. And so those droplets need to float through the air. You can't even see them. You need a certain slide. You need certain technology to pick up on that. But the reason why those droplets are so small is they need to actually land on the mosquito. Those droplets need to cling onto the cuticle. And when that happens, that insecticide needs to then pass through the cuticle of that insect, or in the case mosquito, and then penetrate through the cuticle and go into the inside of the insect to actually get to cause a certain mortality. So from the environment standpoint, no, ULV has been shown to be very safe, especially many of the synthetic pyrethroids that we use nowadays they're considered very low mammalian toxicity. I'd always like to point out, though, with anything, anything can be toxic in high levels, but the way that we apply this is very, very safe, especially when you compare things, how things were done 50 years ago with some of the harsher insecticides. So third question, what time of year do mosquitoes typically reemerge? Well, for those of you who live in Florida and Louisiana, you'd probably say any year, and you'd be right. We've actually seen this year to be a very mild winter, and the mosquito season has not stopped. Mosquitoes will continue to breed and continue to develop as long as temperatures are above 50 degrees. So many times in parts of the Northeast, Middle Atlantic, you may have mosquitoes that will find a tree hole and they'll go into hibernation. So the actual adult will hibernate in this tree hole. But that doesn't mean that on a mild winter day, in this case, today's February, it's in the month of February, we have 82 degrees outside, that mosquito will become active again and will be able to fly and feed. So really it depends on what area of the country you're in. But at the same time, if you have a mild winter or a mild spring, mosquitoes can actually breed and feed throughout the year. But obviously they just certainly go to a hibernation or a quiescent period during the winter. Fourth question, are there any emerging or re-emerging mosquito-borne diseases we should be aware of? As I mentioned, we talked a little bit about Jamestown virus. That's something that you should be aware of. We talk about re-emerging diseases, and I use the examples such as dengue as well as chikungunya to always be on the lookout. With increased travel, these diseases still pose a risk even for folks here in the United States. Fifth question, is there anything residents need to do to prepare for mosquito applications? Most mosquito applications take place in the morning or late in the evening, and that's usually due to the thermal inversion. That is, it allows that insecticide to settle down so it doesn't spray all over the place. You want that insecticide to actually stay level to the ground where it actually works on the insects. So obviously, if you know of a time where a spray truck is coming through, it's certainly a good idea to perhaps close those windows if you don't want any of those things to come through. And usually an odor is sometimes reported. And so, and many times those odors are actually put in there for safety reasons. But that's something that you certainly can prepare. Close your windows, put your cars inside if you're afraid of having any of the residual mosquito landing on the paint or something like that. Sixth question is, what are the common symptoms of mosquito-borne diseases? Well, usually viruses, the ones that we talked about, dengue, chikungunya. Like other viruses, you usually will have a high fever. Some viruses will develop a rash, achy joints, headache, very severe headaches. In severe cases with dengue, if it moved to a dengue, what they call dengue hemorrhagic fever, which is bursting of the blood vessels, you can have bleeding, things like that. That's not good, obviously. But those are the most common diseases. You can get some dizziness with some of your encephalotide viruses. And obviously, severe cases would involve a coma or something like that. So that's something we would definitely want to avoid, something like a horrible state like that. Are all mosquitoes capable of transmitting diseases? No. Many mosquitoes do not transmit diseases. And in fact, the majority of mosquitoes probably don't. When I say probably, because we're constantly finding new viruses, and sometimes those viruses are specific to that mosquito. So many mosquitoes do not transmit viruses, and so that's a good thing, and that's why it's so important to do surveillance. It really provides you a good idea as to the risk level in your area. How do I know when a mosquito-borne disease has been reported in my area? Usually the CDC or your local Department of Health in your county will keep tabs of mosquito-borne diseases. You usually can go to their website and find that information, or the CDC. Usually communities that do have a high rate of West Nile, usually there's a message that they put out to the public, and usually they will also activate some kind of mosquito control program, whether that is contracted or managed throughout the state. How does climate change affect the spread of mosquito-borne diseases? Well, certainly, as we see with increasing change in precipitation, as well as temperature, those are the two factors, temperature, increase in temperature, and precipitation, you can expect mosquito-bornes or mosquitoes to also develop in high numbers, and as well as the risk of mosquito-borne diseases will go up as well, usually. How do I measure the effectiveness of your integrated mosquito management program? Plain and simple is if you have if you're incorporating all those things that we talked about. So if you're doing that surveillance piece, if you're spraying, but you're only spraying when you need to be, and you use the surveillance to guide your decision making, and you're doing the public education piece, and you're focusing on larvicide over adulticide, and finally getting public buy-in from the local community, from public education. Those things will really provide you the best mosquito management program that you have, as well as keeping up with the latest research or diseases that might be, we're seeing diseases sometimes that come in to the United States. So being aware that if you have diseases coming into Florida, that's something that you might want to be concerned about, especially if you live there, and something you want to keep an eye out in your surveillance piece. Okay, well, it's been a pleasure to be with you today. I hope that we captured some of your questions that you had, and I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you all out there sometime. Take care.